So we just created a date time object, but still there's a question, how do we exactly think about these objects in the software world, or say in the world of programming? Now, really think just like in our day-to-day life, we have hundreds of objects that we use. For example, say shoes, umbrella, bicycle, and so on and so forth. There are literally hundreds of them. Each of these objects have a utility value. We do specific tasks with them. In fact, this model also applies to the software world, to the world of programming. What we are doing is to create objects which mimic these objects and which do a specific functionality for us. For example, let's say we talk about the datetime object. Now, this is allowing us to put numbers in a logical way and view them as a date rather than isolated numbers. So, for example, when I said 29th February 1977, now 29, 2, and 1977 are not being viewed as isolated numbers, but in fact, it's being viewed as a date. And this guy tells me immediately, look, this is not even a valid date. So, what is happening is that because of this object, we can do some computations that are meaningful or relevant with respect to the kind of object that we are dealing with. Now, this mental model is good enough. For now, we really do not want to get bogged down by this because this is a huge topic in itself and things become more clear as we use it. But I do want to highlight some important terminology. When it comes to objects, there are two important concepts: attributes and methods. Attributes refers to the values, that, for example, year related to a particular date. Methods are basically functions or the capabilities, the actions that the object can perform. Yeah, for example, we can find out weekday on a certain date, and so on and so forth. Now, again, this becomes clear as you go along. However, you'll see these terms, so I thought it's important to introduce. Amazingly, a beautiful analogy comes from something that we know already very, very well. Our good old friend Sprite, in fact, tells us all these concepts in a beautiful way. Think about it. Every sprite had attributes. For example, their X and Y positions, we are so familiar with this, their direction, their size, their costume. Those are the things that determined how the sprite looked, where it was, what size it was, and so on and so forth. Also, Sprite had some methods which were relevant to the sprite. For example, there were code blocks with which Sprite could do, specific things like moving forward, moving backward, changing size, and so on and so forth. And hence, my view of it is that at this stage, it's sufficient to think of all these objects as just like some kind of invisible sprites which are doing a very specific purpose for us. Now, in case of datetime object, it's basically helping us organize data so that we can look at it like dates. I think this is quite a powerful one. Now, let's just go back to our code for a little while. Remember, we are creating this datetime object. So it asks me what year you were born in. I say 1977. Which month I say, for example, 1, and then I say 31. So now my date birth is, so this particular object as we saw earlier. Now, as I told you, there are certain attributes of this, there are certain values associated with this. How can I get that? For example, if I did date birth dot year. Now notice here, I am not doing dt.datebirth.year because I've already created this object, this invisible sprite whose name is date birth. So all I have to do is to go and ask it, hey, look, I want to know what is the year in your, year value for you. And I do that by saying datebirth.year. And if I did that, I get 1977. No surprise because that's what I created this with. In fact, I can go and probe also, for example, the month, and indeed that's 1 because that's what I did. I can go and probe, for example, the day, again that is 31. Again, I provided this. I could have provided more information, but now I did not. So it's just going to tell me, if I look at its hour is 0, and also if I look at the minute, it's also 0. But obviously, if I'd asked more questions, I could have created the object with these details as well. Notice that these are attributes and hence I can just probe them. I can get their value. But like I said, objects also have a capability to do certain things. Those are called methods. For example, in case of our sprite could move forward, backward, become small, issue broadcast, create clones, and so on and so forth. Those are all methods that Sprite provided. In case of date birth, one important method we are going to look at is this method called the weekday. Now, one difference between calling attributes and calling methods is that whenever we call a method, we must put this closing brackets. Okay, now this is important. So when I want to do this, if I say date birth dot weekday, in fact it returns me 0. Now we will see in a little while what does all this mean, but we can take one more example. Let's say I take the very next day, right, which is, let's say, so let's say my birthday was 1977. second month and the first day, which is the next day from where I was, earlier. Now, if I did, let's say date, date birth is again the same, the date time object. So if I said date birth dot say week day. Now remember, this is a method, so I must use this, closing brackets. If I did this, now notice it returns me one because it is basically the next day. Now we will come back, to understand what this really means. How can we make this human readable and so on? But I hope this gave you an idea. Now I do want to highlight that try not to get bogged down by all these things too much. These things become more and more natural as you go along. As you do more programming, a lot of these concepts will come into place, will fall into place by themselves, right? So take care, enjoy this process, and keep moving. All right, take care. Thank you so much. Bye bye.